Uh, Good evening, Professor Radha Chakravarty from the entire team of Gnosis. Good to see you today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation within such a short span of time. Just to inform you, ma'am, Gnosis lecture started from May 17th, and today is the last lecture. And in the due course of time, we have already organized 30 lectures, and yours is the 31st one. Yes, I'm unmuting you. There is some technical issues, when I unmute it takes 5 minutes to get. Yeah, now your thing is unmuted. So good evening, ma'am. From the entire team of Gnosis, we are really happy and honored to have you. I have already shared your abstract and bio note with the participants. They are well aware of it, of your writing. One of the main, just to inform the participants, one of the main areas of research of Professor Radha Chakravarty is Tagore. She has written a plethora of books on Tagore from very reputed publications. Presently serving as professor in Ambedkar University, Delhi. I like the department name of her department. It's called the School of Letters. It's a lovely name, and it's something which we hardly see. So she belongs from the School of Letters department, from the School of Letters, Ambedkar University, and has worked extensively on Tagore. And we are in for a treat today on Tagore. And thank you, ma'am, for once again for joining us and accepting our invitation within such a short span of time. It's lovely to see you, and over to you, ma'am. We already have 265 people eager to listen to you. Over to you, ma'am.
So, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Dr. Sarkot Banerjee, Soham Pine, and to Gnosis for inviting me to speak at this forum, because I think this is a wonderful initiative and a very impressive array of speakers and subjects that were shared with me. I will speak here today about Rabindranath Tagore as a public intellectual. And in the first part of my presentation, I will think about the idea of the public intellectual and some of the influences on Tagore, particularly his debt to some early pre-modern Indian thought leaders such as the Buddha and Kabir. And then I will move to a consideration of what was his contribution as a public intellectual across different fields of practice, creativity, and thought. So we will consider Tagore as a polymath and his overall legacy. And towards the end, I will argue for the need for a radical reappraisal of Tagore from a 21st century point of view, to think about how, while he was a public intellectual for his own times, how we can rethink Tagore as an intellectual for our times as well, and about his importance for us today. And in the process, I think we'll be touching upon many spheres of his thought and practice, which would open up possibilities for further research and inquiry in the field of Tagore studies. I want to begin with a short extract from Tagore's play Chandalika, where Anando, a thirsty Buddhist monk, begs an untouchable girl Prakriti for water. He says, "Water, give me water. The sun is at its harshest, very long the path. Give me water. I am hot, parched. Give me water. I am fatigued. Give me water." But the girl is from a low caste, her touch condemned by society as impure. So Prakriti, the girl, refuses to give water. She says, "Forgive me, Lord, forgive. I am a Chandal's daughter. Water from my well is unclean. I have no right to the virtue of giving you water. I am a Chandal's daughter." But the monk insists. Ananda says, "The human in me is the human in you, daughter. That water is pilgrimage water, which satisfies those athirst, which cools those hot and fatigued. That is pure water. Water, give me water." She offers him water. The grateful Ananda departs, invoking the blessings of the Buddha upon her. For Prakriti, This encounter proves nothing short of miraculous, for in Ananda's acceptance of her gift of water, she awakens to a new sense of her own human selfhood and dignity. In raptures, she exclaims, "This is a new birth for me." Through its invocation of the teachings of the Buddha, Tagore's play implicitly critiques religious bigotry, the tyranny of the caste system, and social taboos like the concept of untouchability in his own times. Often at odds with the world around him, opposing colonial rule as well as communal politics and blind orthodoxies amongst his own people, Tagore uses the Buddha's teachings as a trope that legitimizes his own message of peaceful coexistence for a world fragmented by hatred and violence. Figures such as the Buddha and Kabir act as inspirational models for Tagore in his own self-fashioning as a public intellectual. This lecture examines Rabindranath Tagore's writings to understand his role as a public intellectual in his own times, to argue that his inclusive, transformative vision remains important for our own contemporary world. In an essay called The Condolence Meeting, which he gave in 1894 upon the demise of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Tagore argues that contact with European culture is transforming both external conditions and the subjective feelings of the people of his land, creating new social needs that demand new modes to fulfill them. He feels that Indian society, which had long been a domestic, or as he says, Garhastya Pradhan realm, now has a new element, the public sphere, generating new responsibilities, including that of educating the public. Writing this at the end of the 19th century, Tagore is aware of a world in flux and of the need to construct a modernity appropriate for this scene. Through his interpretations of the role played by pre-modern spiritual leaders in the radical reimagining of social and epistemological structures, Tagore seeks to project a broad civilizational perspective that transcends what he perceives as the limits of colonial and nationalist discourses, religious orthodoxy, and oppressive societal norms. His literary reconstructions of the legacy of these predecessors help to locate his own practice in an imagined trajectory of emancipatory discourses through the ages, legitimizing his own vision of a more inclusive, egalitarian, and heterogeneous world. In this vision, the relationship between knowledge, language, and power occupies a central place. In a lecture delivered at the University of Calcutta in 1932, Tagore speaks of India's ancient universities, including Nalanda, describing knowledge as a river in which everyone can bathe. His stance anticipates Ramila Thapar's statements on the emergence of the public intellectual in India, and I'm quoting Thapar here. For most of us, heritage seems to exist only in monuments, in some objects from the past and or in religious rituals. But we do have an intellectual heritage of thought, ideas, and actions. This heritage goes beyond monuments and rituals and often has universal characteristics that cut across religion and social codes. This is the heritage that we need to recover. Unquote. It is in this sense that Tagore seeks to keep alive the legacy of his illustrious pre-modern predecessors. And he says, "What an arid desert is the heart that allows the stream of ancient ages to dry up." He says this in the essay, The Music of the Bowls, and continues, "If we discover something in ancient literature that strikes a chord in our hearts, what wonder, what delight we experience. Because at once, for an instant, as in a flash of lightning, we catch a glimpse of the connecting thread that binds our age with the endless succession of epochs. unquote. Here, Tagore affirms his sense of a continuous tradition of thought and practice that links our contemporary reality to the past, and implicitly he places himself within it. Tagore was acutely conscious of his image as a public figure. To Bengalis in India, Tagore was Gurudev, the revered poet sage. In the Western world, he came to be seen as the mystical wise man with a spiritual message from the East. Tagore himself did much to perpetuate these stereotypes and remained sensitive to his fluctuating reputation throughout his life. Although he withdrew from overt participation in politics after he became disenchanted with the Swadeshi movement in the early 20th century, he continued to express his views on contemporary world affairs more indirectly through his literary writings, letters, and personal interactions. His invocation of public personalities from the past can be read as part of this process of masked socio-political and philosophical commentary. Tagore's position as a public intellectual was in fact strengthened by his withdrawal from affiliation to any particular political movement or faction. Edward Said, in Representations of the Intellectual, published in 1993, speaks of the intellectual's commitment to championing freedom and knowledge, often from the position of an outsider to mainstream institutions, who inhabits the cusp between private and public realms and challenges the status quo. In the public role of writers and intellectuals, Said says, and I quote, the intellectual's role is first to present alternative narratives and other perspectives on history than those than those provided by combatants on behalf of official memory and national identity. The second is to construct fields of coexistence rather than fields of battle as the outcome of intellectual labor. For Said, Tagore's relationship with his own society exemplifies this role. Romila Thapar also emphasizes the importance of autonomy for the public intellectual. She says, today, as always, the public intellectual is expected to take a position independent of those in power, enabling him or her to question debatable ideas, irrespective of who propagates them. The public intellectual has to see himself or herself as a person who is as close to being autonomous as possible, and more than that, be seen by others as such. Both Said and Thapar emphasize the importance of rationality and critical questioning as defining features of the public intellectual. What emerges in Tagore's work, however, is a combination of the rational critical faculty with a recognition of something beyond, closer to intuition, imagination, and affect as a potential source of alternative versions of knowledge and wisdom. In the construction of his public persona as the voice of a new modernity, Tagore sometimes drew on dominant Western rationalist traditions in his critique of obsolete orthodoxies. But instead of positioning himself as the inheritor of those European traditions, he adopted an eclectic worldview, often seeking inspiration from the lives and works of a range of prominent pre-modern thinkers, sages, and poets from his own part of the world, which we today loosely refer to as South Asia. The Buddha, Kabir, Chaitanya, and Nanak were among these inspirational figures. All of them, though separated by long gaps in time and geography, attempted to bridge the gap between sacred and secular, the social and the spiritual. All challenged the orthodoxies of the dominant religion, wrote and preached in the vernacular rather than the classical languages of the scriptures, and embraced an egalitarian, inclusive outlook. In his own life and work, Rabindranath often took his cue from them. According to Ranjan Ghosh, and I quote, the secular becomes sacred in allowing itself to be invaded by dissenting forces unhegemonic discourses, and certain non-sovereign modes of value formation. The faith in this proactive sacred can often mean interrogating one's hitherto understood values and moralities of religion. Unquote. Tagore's own thought and practice relied on this spirit of questioning. As a Brahmo, he questioned the rigidities of Brahmanical Hinduism. As a social thinker, he interrogated hierarchies, divisions, injustices. As a creative writer, he drew these strands together in his writings across multiple genres. As a political ideologue, he asserted an anti-imperialist position, even as he insisted on the limits of nationalism, placing humanism above the claims of nationhood. In his stance, Tagore anticipates the words of Sundar Sarukkai, who speaks of the spirit of skepticism, which he says is not about demolishing all beliefs and truths, but more about justification and rightness of certain principles, concepts, or ideas. Unquote. So, to go back to the scene from Chandalika, which I cited at the beginning of this lecture, the scene draws on this spirit of skepticism about orthodox socio-religious practices. From the Buddha, Tagore draws insights on the idea of nonviolence, inclusiveness, and rejection of materialism. In Vishwabodh, or world consciousness, Tagore speaks of the quest, and I'm quoting, the quest for acquiring a universal consciousness, of extending one's experience to unite with all. The Buddha attempted to fully develop this consciousness by adopting a path through which the human mind expanded from non-violence to compassion and from compassion to a sense of universal brotherhood. Unquote. The all-embracing humanism that defines Tagore's own thought resonates with lessons he drew from the Buddha's teachings. Anguished at the vision of a world fragmented by materialism, greed, hatred, violence, and hunger for power, Tagore invokes the Buddha's memory to address the problems of his own times. In the radical play Notir Puja, or the Dancing Girl's Worship, Tagore dramatizes the story of the courtesan Srimati, who persists in her worship of the Buddha with his message of peace and non-violence in the face of persecution by the bigoted Hindu king Ajatashatru. Through the aesthetics of song and dance, Srimati professes her devotion to the Buddha even at the cost of her life. The play posits the Buddha's message as an antidote to the violence of religious intolerance. And I quote a passage of song from the play. The world today is wild with the delirium of hatred. The conflicts are cruel and unceasing in anguish. Crooked are its paths, tangled its bonds of greed. All creatures are crying for a new birth of thine, O thou of boundless life. O serene, O free, in thine immeasurable mercy and goodness, wipe away all dark stains from the heart of this earth. The song, calling for the rebirth of the Buddha as savior, critiques communitarian violence in Tagore's own times and positions the poet himself as the inheritor of the Buddha's legacy as messenger of peace. Likewise, Kabir to Tagore represents an early model for the modern public intellectual and stands for a cluster of values, including a concern for social equality and a faith beyond any single faith. Inspired by Shiti Mohan Sen's Hindi translations, Tagore translated 100 Kabir poems into English. Here we encounter Kabir's dismissal of all forms of orthodox religion. And in Tagore's translation, here are some lines from Kabir, which say, O servant, where dost thou seek me? Lo, I am beside thee. I am neither in temple nor in mosque. I am neither in Kaaba nor in Kailash. Neither am I in rites and ceremonies, nor in yoga and renunciation. If thou art a true seeker, thou shalt at once see me. Thou shalt meet me in a moment of time. Through translation, Tagore implicitly endorses Kabir's radical questioning of social hierarchies, as in these lines, which I will read out, where Kabir says, "It is but folly to ask what the caste of a saint may be. The barber has sought God, the washerwoman, and the carpenter. Hindus and Muslims alike have achieved that end, where remains no mark of distinction." Kabir's poetry anticipates Tagore's own rejection of asceticism in favor of a full immersion in worldly life as the true path to faith. And again, two lines of Kabir translated by Tagore, where he says, "Why put on the robe of the monk and live aloof from the world in lonely pride? Behold, my heart dances in the delight of 100 arts, and the Creator is well pleased." Tagore's poem, Kabir and the Woman, recounts the legendary episode where the king and the Brahmins, enraged at the popularity of Kabir, engage a prostitute to accost him in a public place to taint his reputation. Kabir does not reject the woman. Instead, seeing her impoverished condition, he offers her shelter in his own home. Under his influence, her heart grows pure, but Kabir is shunned by society for harboring a fallen woman. When summoned to the court, Kabir enters accompanied by the woman. Outraged, the king banishes him from the court, and Kabir faces the derision of the Brahmins, but he embraces this humiliation as a token of his devotion. And I'll read the last few lines of the poem, where Kabir is taunted by the Brahmins because he has been cast out of the court, and how he answers. He was hailed with loud laughter from the Brahmins who were waiting in the street. It pierced the woman's heart. She fell at Kabir's feet and said, weeping, "You lifted me out of the mud to besmirch your own fair name." "You are the gift of my Lord," said Kabir, "my crown of humiliation." Unquote. According to Amir Sen, what is explicit in Tagore's Kabir is a sharp rejection of sectarianism, Brahmanical pedantry, irrational forms of worship, and the radical inversion of conventionally accepted values or imageries. However, Tagore does not merely reiterate the views of his pre-modern predecessors. He uses their ideas as a springboard to comment on the context of his own times. Amir Sen argues that he took the view, also found in the bowels, of going by that which was new and dynamic, not stale and uninspiring collections of the old. In Tagore's dynamic reworkings of pre-modern thought into new ideas for the modern public sphere, translation played a major role. Tagore translated Kabir's songs in 1912 to 13 during the period when he was also working on the English Gitanjali, which won him, as we know, the Nobel Prize. He also translated Tukaram, Nanak, and the Bowls of Bengal. In a sense, of course, all his renderings of the pre-modern thinkers who inspired him are translations of their thoughts into contemporary contexts. More importantly, Tagore seems to situate himself as a public intellectual through a process of translation, virtually representing himself as a translated version of his predecessors. Tagore's sources of inspiration, though, were not confined to pre-modern indigenous thinkers alone. He had a wide-ranging, eclectic mind that responded freely to influences from far and wide. Although he was against imperialism, he did not reject Western cultures entirely. Through his reading and extensive travels, he was exposed to the values and traditions of diverse cultures from across the world, and this is reflected in his creative writing as well as his practices as a thinker, educator, and public intellectual. For he was, in the truest sense of the word, a polymath. And in the next part of the lecture, we will look at Tagore the polymath and his legacy as a public intellectual. Tagore is best known to the world as Gurudev, the poet sage who took the world by storm with the Nobel Prize that followed the publication of the English Gitanjali. But he also wrote essays, novels, stories, plays, travelogues, songs, satirical pieces, and autobiographical works. Beyond his literary output, he was an artist, educationist, and social thinker. He experimented with agriculture and the economics of microcredit and was a secularist in a world riven by religious strife. His love for nature extended beyond poetry and song to a prescient concern for the preservation of our environment. A genius with a deep sense of rootedness in local culture, he had a distinctive and complex vision of nationhood and was also an internationalist who saw himself as a citizen of the world. Beyond the world, he looked out to the universe and saw himself as a microcosmic but vital part of the whole of creation. Tagore never stopped experimenting in diverse creative fields. At the end of his life, he had even entered the field of cinema, predicting that it was the creative medium of the future. At 70, he blossomed into a visual artist. His restless genius roamed the entire field of human knowledge, as if seeking a completion that he had never found. He only expressed himself, he not only expressed himself in different genres, but also broke the boundaries between them to create composite forms, of which his doodles are perhaps the most extraordinary example. Tagore's stature as a public intellectual rests upon his achievement as a polymath, a genius with many facets. Yet underlying the incredible versatility, there remains a yearning for unity, for the oneness that he intuitively sensed in the universe. For Tagore, of course, this universe was conjured up by a humanist worldview. In his dialogue with Einstein, he staunchly affirms that creation is for him what he calls a human universe. And I quote, he says, "The infinite personality of man comprehends the universe. The truth of the universe is human truth. Matter is composed of protons and electrons with gaps between them. But matter may seem to be solid. Similarly, humanity is composed of individuals, yet they have their interconnection of human relationship. The entire universe is linked up with us in a similar manner. It is a human universe." This unity was not something that Tagore achieved. It remained a utopian quest that was the wellspring of his phenomenal output in a myriad different forms. But what remains constant is his faith in the power of the human imagination, especially in the power of words and the seeing eye. In the poem Ami, or I, from Shamoli, he says, and I quote, "It was from my sentence that the emerald derived its green, the ruby its red. I turned my eyes upon the sky, and there was light in the east and to the west. I looked at the rose and said, 'You are beautiful,' and the rose gained its beauty." This belief in the ability of the human mind to shape the world we live in is immensely empowering, but it also comes with a great responsibility, for it means that it is for us to make our own universe. Faced with this daunting task, we cannot adopt a passive role, but must accept our accountability towards the space we inhabit and the social, political, and psychological environment we bring into being. And this was Tagore's perception of himself and his role as the public intellectual. The range and extent of Tagore's creative oeuvre is well known. Perhaps it's worth considering in more depth some of the other fields to which he contributed. As educationist, he created Vishwabharati, an open space where the best in creative and intellectual traditions from across the world would find a place. The motto of Vishwabharati, Yatra Vishwam Bhavatyeka, where the world makes its home in a single nest, expresses this philosophy. The idea of drawing together the best that every culture has to offer is not to fuse these diverse elements into a monolith, but to create a dynamic space for dialogue and mutual recognition across cultures, languages, and systems of thought. Today, in the domain of higher education, the colonial model of a meritocracy based on a fetishization of narrow specialization has significantly devalued the importance of such eclectic, inclusive, and heterogeneous possibilities. In the race for professional success, the idea of education as a development of the human personality as a whole, the ideal of learning as a way of realizing human potential to the fullest possible extent, have fallen by the wayside. Knowledge, in Tagore's egalitarian ethic, is for everyone, not the exclusive domain of the privileged few. In his essays on education, he describes knowledge as a stream in which everyone can bathe. In today's debates about social justice and affirmative action in higher education, Tagore's ideas about inclusiveness in education carry a significant charge. Throughout his life, Tagore remains alive to social issues. His sensitivity to the woman question has attracted much discussion. He writes, for instance, of female desire in Chokirbali, women's role in nationalism in Gora, women's education in Khata, and the transgression of gender boundaries in Chitrangoda. In the essay Nari, he celebrates women as the harbingers of a new, more egalitarian world. In Chondalika, he addresses the problem of untouchability, and through his poems and translations, he expresses his secular approach to religion. His short stories focus on forms of oppression suffered by those at the margins of society. His own stay in the family estates at Shilaidaho in East Bengal when he was a young man sensitized him to the plight of the rural population in Bengal and contributed much to this empathy for the downtrodden and the awareness that one day the forms of domination that prevail today will boomerang on those who perpetrate them. In a prophetic vein, he writes in Stray Birds, and I quote, "Man's history is waiting in patience for the triumph of the insulted man," unquote. Inclusiveness and recognition of heterogeneity are central to Tagore's social vision. In Gitanjali, he expresses the importance of reaching out to our others. And I will quote a few lines from Gitanjali, where he says, "Thou hast made me known to friends whom I knew not. Thou hast given me seats in homes not my own. Thou hast brought the distant near and made a brother of the stranger. When one knows thee, then alien there is none, then no door is shut. O grant me my prayer that I may never lose the bliss of the touch of the one in the play of many." In the realm of politics, too, Tagore's thoughts on nationalism evolve in a highly nuanced fashion. Initially at the forefront of the Swadeshi movement, he later withdrew from it uh, when some factions gave the movement a militant Hindu complexion and used violence as a weapon. In his essays on nationalism, he castigates the West for its militarism and aggressive materialist agenda. He dreads the prospect of the idea of one nation being imposed on the world by imperialist power, but does not give up the idea of nationhood per se. In the essay, What is a Nation, which I've translated, he describes the nation as a construct based on the collective memory, aspirations, and will to action of an entire people. He composed the songs that would become the national anthems of India and Bangladesh and surrendered his knighthood in protest against the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh. But for Tagore, humanism remains a greater good than nationalism. In Society and State, or Swadeshi Samaj, he says, and I quote, "Every nation is part of humanity, and each must answer the question, what have you to give to man? What new ways have you discovered for his happiness?" Tagore's idea of the human does not correspond to the universalizing tendencies of liberal humanism in the West. It gestures rather at alternative versions of humanism based on recognition and tolerance of difference. It also challenges the Eurocentric ideal of reason by positing instead a different version of subjectivity. In his essay, The Philosophy of Leisure, Tagore says, and I quote, "The perfection of our personality does not principally consist of qualities that generate cleverness or deftness or even accuracy of observation or the rationality that analyzes and forms generalizations. It depends mostly on our training in truth and love, upon ideals that go to the root of our being." Unquote. To be human, in Tagore's terms, is to transcend national boundaries, to be willing to embrace the alien and the other. An inveterate traveler, Rabindranath roamed the globe to know his fellow humans from remote parts of the earth. Without a fully formulated political philosophy, he nevertheless came to mediate between nations as a figure perceived as India's cultural ambassador to the world. Aware of this public role, he spoke of promoting a worldwide commerce of heart and mind. Tagore's love for nature is equally complex, for it is much more than a simple aesthetic or poetic impulse. A sense of oneness with the environment forms a visceral part of his very consciousness. In Chinnapatragoli, he writes of this primordial bond with the ecology of our planet, and I quote, "This earth, like someone I have loved long through many births, remains ever new to me. The two of us share a very deep and extensive acquaintance. I can well remember that many ages ago, when the youthful earth had freshly emerged from her immersion in the sea to offer homage to the young son of that era, I had blossomed into foliage as a tree in the new soil of this earth in a primal life urge that came from who knows where." In Shantiniketan, as Mahashrita Devi, who studied there in school and later in college, as Mahashrita Devi recalls from her own young days in Shantiniketan, children were taught never to harm any living creature or break a single leaf or flower from a tree. For Tagore, the traditional nature-culture divide does not exist as a simple dualism. Rather, as the Shantiniketan experiment shows, nature becomes for him the place from where the advancement of human civilization can begin. Tagore never sees the world as a monolith. In his conversation with H.G. Wells, he complains, "The tendency in modern civilization is to make the world uniform. Calcutta, Bombay, Hong Kong, and other cities are more or less alike, wearing big masks which represent no country in particular." His words seem prescient, for they resonate with current debates about the culturally homogenizing effects of globalization. In the essay titled "Music of the Bowels," he declares, and I quote, "Sameness and difference both must be taken into account. Without difference, the world cannot survive at all. If the temperature everywhere became uniform, the wind would not blow, the river would not flow, our spirit would not survive." Yet for Tagore, the play of difference does not correspond to our current theoretical celebrations of plurality without value. At the heart of all his wide-ranging endeavors, we find a strong core of ethical, social, political, philosophical, and aesthetic value that provides the backbone of his vibrant vision of human society and the universe. Tagore was a man of his times, but also in many ways ahead of his times. Throughout his travels, his pleas for change often met with mixed responses because his audiences were perhaps not ready for his message. Yet Tagore never quite lost faith in the emergence of a better future for the world. In Crisis of Civilization, he articulates a dark, despairing vision of the present. And I quote, "From one end of the world to the other, the poisonous fumes of hatred darken the atmosphere." But even at the conclusion of this dystopian essay, he affirms his faith in humankind. Tagore's ideas changed and evolved through his long trajectory as a writer. Often, they reveal complexities and tensions between contradictory impulses. As he tells us, he was born at a time of great social and intellectual ferment in Bengal at the confluence of three great movements: the sweeping tide of social reform, a new blossoming of literature and the arts, and the swelling wave of nationalism. In his own home, he was exposed to a host of intercultural influences and a combination of liberal and conservative practices that created deep fissures in his psyche. These manifest themselves in diverse aspects of his life. Though from a privileged zamindar family, he writes with great sympathy about the poor and marginalized. For a male writer, he evinces a remarkable empathy for women and a strong concern for their position in society. Yet, we cannot quite call him a feminist. A reveler in the joys of living, he also has a profound awareness of death. As a social thinker, he feels drawn to the world. But as an artist, he feels the pull of solitude. These tensions are never resolved in Tagore's work, nor do his activities in different fields dovetail neatly with one another. In fact, the complexity of Tagore's thought and self-expression draws audiences across generations into the dynamic process of reinterpreting his many-layered work. Such critical revaluations are indeed the need of the hour. And this is what I want to say by way of conclusion. We need to break down the stereotypes of Gurudev and the wise man from the East to reconsider Tagore's legacy from a contemporary perspective. For Tagore, the public intellectual of his own times continues to hold immense relevance for our times as well. As readers in the 21st century, we need perhaps to consider how our own world may have appeared to Tagore if he had been alive today. In his essay, Construction versus Creation, Tagore says, and I quote, "Modern science has outwardly brought all mankind close together, as you can see in our Zoom meeting today." But he adds, "The outer bonds of telegraph wires and railway lines have helped men all the more efficiently to tear one another to pieces and rob their weaker fellow beings of food, of freedom, and of self-respect." Unquote. This he wrote in 1920. 100 years later, barring a few technological details, this picture doesn't seem too far removed from our own reality today. As an alternative to this scenario, Tagore posits and I'm quoting, "the divine ideal of personality. For the ultimate truth in man is not in his intellect or in his material wealth. It is in his imagination of sympathy, in his illumination of heart, in his activities of self-sacrifice, in his capacity of extending love far and wide across all barriers of caste and color." Unquote. Perhaps Tagore's writings do not present the actualization of this ideal, but they remind us of things that we in our modern age are often too busy to heed. Today, the onus is on us to draw from his legacy the inspiration and the creative and intellectual resources that can help us meet the challenges of the world we live in today. For as Tagore signals, the human imagination is infinite, and to open our minds to the vastness of our universe in a questioning spirit is to enter a realm of speculation rife with myriad. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an insightful lecture and enriching lecture
Thank
on
you.
Tagore. Tagore is like a very integral part of our emotions as well as academics as well. So uh, you can well understand.
May I request you to speak a little louder? I can't hear you clearly.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much for your enriching and engrossing presentation. And as Tagore is an integral part of our life, be it emotionally or academics. There are plethora of queries that are being asked, apart from a lot of congratulatory remarks of your quality of your presentation. So, if you
Thank you.
permit, I will go forward with few of the questions.
Please, yes.
Yeah, the first question. Yes, the first question is from Dr. Muhammad Akram from Pakistan. His question is, Tagore is regarded as a mystifying figure. What was his dominant idea about the ultimate joy of spirituality with reference to his Nobel winning Gitanjali?
Can you please repeat that? The ultimate joy of spirituality?
Ultimate joy of spirituality. What was his dominant idea about the ultimate joy of spirituality with reference to Gitanjali?
Right. I think that's a wonderful question. I did bring up Gitanjali a couple of times in my presentation, but did not dwell on it a great deal. I think what he seems to suggest is the kind of joy that comes from a spirituality that does not take us away from our world and our life here, in the here and now, into some faraway, remote domain of the spiritual, but he sees the eternal as manifest in the concrete, in the beauty of the world that is around us, in the physicality of our existence here. He says the same stream of life that runs across the universe also flows in my own bloodstream. So he sees the macrocosm as represented in the smallest fibers of existence, and that is the joy of spirituality. That is the beauty he sees, and it is about not denying any aspect of life, but finding the spiritual, the eternal manifest in the transient, in the concrete, in the physicality of the here and now.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Dr. Debulana Guha from Kolkata. First of all, she congratulates and I congratulates you, and I quote her, very informative and enlightening. Thank you, ma'am. Now comes her two questions. Question number one: born to a Pirayali Brahmin family, son of a Brahmo father, and himself a string upholder of the same, recurrence of Buddhism in his works. What is your take on his syncretism?
On his
Syncretism.
syncretism. Again, I think a very pertinent question, and you have very perceptively connected Tagore's views with the circumstances of his life, that he's descended from a Pirali Brahmin family that is not quite accepted, in the pure Brahmanical fold, and he grows up in a Brahmo household which critiques all kinds of religious orthodoxy and which is a monotheistic reformist sect. And from within that, for him to reach out for the ideas of the Buddha, I think these forms of interrogation arise from precisely the kind of very eclectic upbringing he had. His father, Debendranath, was a deeply spiritual person, very well versed in the Upanishads, and he had a great influence on Tagore. But Tagore was also exposed through his travels and pilgrimages to the ideas and ideals of thinkers like Nanak. He went to Amritsar, where he was deeply influenced by the ideas of Nanak. He was deeply influenced by the ideas of Kabir, by the Buddha. So I think we see an amalgamation of streams of influence in the kind of composite faith that he expresses in his writings. And this syncretism was in part because of his home atmosphere, which I referred to, where Western and Indian influences combined, and where all kinds of languages, ideas, and cultural practices were very much part of the ethos. But there was also social ferment around him at the time when he was born and during the years when he grew up, all of which contributed, I think, to Tagore's openness to multiple ideas. And this was something which remained with him throughout his life.
Thank you, ma'am. Her second question is, what role did his idea or understanding of science play in his emerging as a public intellectual?
Of science? Are you talking about science? I'm sorry, I can't
Yes,
hear
yes, yes.
clearly.
What role did
Okay.
his idea or understanding of science play in his emerging as a public intellectual?
Again, a question that is important. Perhaps it's a little known fact, but Tagore wrote science textbooks for children. He wrote about the planets and the stars in the sky. And we have already talked about his love for nature and the environment. I've just been translating Mahashrita Devi's memoirs of the childhood years that she spent in Shantiniketan, where she talks about how science was taught there. and how they learned through direct contact with trees, flowers, plants, the seasons, how they held various festivals to celebrate the seasons, how they had a tree planting festival. And she describes how she told her science teacher, it is very hard to love all creatures. I can't say, I don't like snakes. And the teacher took her to a tree and asked her to put her hand in the hollow of the tree and pull out a bundle of small, harmless snakes. And he said, look, these snakes are not poisonous. They're natural creatures. They're small. They're harmless. Just let them go. Let them live. And this was perhaps a more important lesson for her than something she could have learned from a textbook. So I think Tagore had a very holistic view of knowledge, and without being a scientist himself, he had considerable interest in science and in the laws that govern the universe. He did believe that there are laws that govern the universe, and he did believe that education should be all-rounded and include these things. Also, learning from a skeleton. He describes how he learned human anatomy from a skeleton that hung in his house, and later he wrote a well-known ghost story based on skeleton. So his idea of science came from the idea of directly encountering the world around us and trying to imbibe from there the knowledge of it. And this was what he practiced as an educator as well in the principles on which Shantiniketan was run. So in part, this was an aspect of his role as the public intellectual, that as an educationist in his theories and in his writings on education, he believed that education should not be about narrow specialization, and that all disciplines have a place for the human mind, for the full development of the human personality.
Thank you, ma'am. Sanjit Sarkar questions,
Yes.
critics and readers have different views on Tagore's concept of Jivan Devta. What is your view about his Jivan Devta?
Yes, this is a very vast topic and very hard to answer in a few sentences. But the idea that he evolved towards Jivan Devata, or Lord of one's life, was something which I believe he evolved towards because his faith became more and more anthropocentric. His belief in the God who resides inside man, inside the human soul, and therefore the God who is not somebody remote or far away, but God in the human soul. And we see here the influence also of the Bauls and others, Bauls, the Sufis, who have this spiritual quest that leads them within, and they believe in the presence of the divinity within the human soul rather than through external forms of worship directed at an external deity. So I believe that Jivan Devata was this inner fount of spirituality and inspiration, to which he gave this mysterious name, which has continuously been debated.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Ananya Bhattacharya, research scholar from Jadavpur University. She says that Sujit Mukherjee, in his book Translation as Discovery, calls Tagore's self-translation of Gitanjali into English as perjury because he has anglicized the ethos of the original text in his use of images, symbols, and metaphors to such an extent that the English translation looks like a different text written at a different backdrop as compared to the original text. When Tagore has raised his deep concern over the Anglicization of Indian culture and society due to unmistakable impact of colonialism, then why did he himself succumb to such a domestication of his own writing into the culture and ethos of the target language?
Yeah, this is something I have written about extensively in an article, which is about shifting paradigms in Tagore translations. When Tagore tried to translate his own works into English, he often did himself a disservice, because the English versions very often did not always come very close to the Bengali originals. He was very diffident about his own English, own command of English, and he has said this many times in his own writings. He did not write English with the same confidence with which he wrote Bengali, and this comes through in his attempt to domesticate his writings for the Western reader. And this is why I think Tagore's writings do need to be retranslated again and again for different generations of readers, because as the language evolves and as the target culture evolves, translations also should not be treated as fixed or static entities. If his texts remain alive for us in the original, I think they need to, be relived through translations, through new translations over time. And in my co-edited volume, The Essential Tagore, this was our aim, to bring Tagore into the 21st century through a combination of different approaches to translations adopted by translators from located in different places. And we carried some of Tagore's own Gitanjali translations, but we also carried translations from Gitanjali passages done by other translators to show up the range of ways in which Tagore can be translated.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll take the last question for today, and that is by a research scholar, Deboshri Bhattacharya. She herself is a Tagore scholar, and she says that I have two questions on the woman issue. The first question is, can characters like... Just a second. Just a second, somebody has unmuted, ma'am. I'm so sorry. Yes, ma'am. Sorry for the interruption. I repeat the question. She herself is a Tagore scholar, and she has basically two questions. Question number one is, can characters like Aparna in Visarjan or Malini, who forgive everyone readily, appear real in the selfish and profit-minded society now?
I think this is the first question?
Yes, ma'am.
This is the first question?
Yes.
So characters like Aparna or Malini, who forgive everyone readily, do they appear selfish and profit-minded? It depends on the questions we bring to texts. I think it's important to read texts in context. And Tagore has a whole range of female characters in his texts. Not all of them are necessarily idealized. He shows a whole spectrum of characters, and through them a whole colorful map of female subjectivities, and Aparna and Malini are to be seen in that relation. But you're also raising an important question which touches upon why I said that we cannot quite call Tagore a feminist in spite of his very active interest in bettering women's position in society, because his approach to women remains ambivalent, and in some respects he does draw on ideas that may strike us as conservative, but in many other ways his views on women are startlingly progressive and ahead of his time.
Thank you, ma'am. Just before I take the second question of her, just to inform the audience and participants that those who have already registered for Gnosis lecture series, they don't have to re-register for the Kirdar series. They will receive the details. It's just the new participants they have to register for the Kirdar series, because I've been getting a lot of questions in the chat box, ma'am. Sorry for the interruption. The second question is, in his essays, Tagore lays great responsibility on women for bringing balance in society for the chaos created by men. Women is the savior. Does that limit women's choice to live their life according to their wish, because they have predefined role to play?
Well, again, a very good question, because yes, in his essays, I find personally that this is a very progressive view to take at a time when, there was this ferment of social reform going on, and there were such controversies and debates between the liberals and the orthodox regarding women's lives and how what norms women were supposed to follow. I do think that seeing women as co-sharers with men of the responsibility of bringing in a better world, and in many ways showing them as the figures who can usher in a better world, is a utopian kind of view premised on a desire for social transformation. But if you see the female figures in his texts, as I was saying in my answer to your previous question, I don't think all of them are idealized figures, nor do all of them present a better world that is achieved. I mean, we see in Gora how Gora and the reader arrive at the realization by the end of the novel that unless women are given due participation in the political world, the new nation cannot emerge in any kind of effective way. But while we see that in many of these texts that some of the female protagonists arrive at a kind of higher realization, they evolve, and they act as agents. They're endowed with agency, but in very few texts do we see the achievement of a perfect society at the end of the interventions of the female characters. I mean, as I said, there is a utopianism in Tagore's vision, but he does not show utopia achieved. He shows us a world that that has many shades of gray, and so do his his female figures represent many different positions on a spectrum of possibilities.
Thank you very much on behalf of the entire team of Gnosis for willing to speak once again and so elegantly answering the questions. The questions
Thank you.
being asked, they are giving the feedbacks. It's very well answered. And as I discussed with you yesterday, that the rest of the questions I will mail you. You please take your time, uh, and whenever you are free, you revert it back to us. We will get it published in the forthcoming issues of Gnosis so that it can also act as an archival help for the academicians. Thank you very much, ma'am. Once again, thank you participants for joining. This is Dr. Shoykot Banerjee signing off, and with this we come to the end of Gnosis lecture series. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you very much.